So I'm Mariko. That's my Twitter handle. If you have any questions, concerns, comments after this, I'm happy to chat online. I write JavaScript at a company called Scripto, which is a very small startup based in New York that makes a software for TV shows used by TV shows like a Colbert Report and late shows. But I'm not talking about that product today. I make a textile with JavaScript, and that's been my side project and kind of passion project for past almost a year now. And I want to share what I do or what I mean by that. So when I say I make textile with JavaScript, that means any given weekend or after hours, my desk looks like this. So that's knitting machine. Believe it or not, there's a mechanic thing called knitting machine that you can program to basically essentially make a knitted fabric faster than you can do by hand. And if you knit by hand for this much of a piece of fabric, it's going to take you 8 hours. In that machine, it only takes 20 minutes. So it's easy to test out new patterns, if you like. And what I mean by make a textile by JavaScript, I have all the gadgets and like regular crafting things, but in the middle, I use computer, and that's the terminal that's open, running a Node.js application, communicating to that machine. So what comes out of that, like what comes out of this lab, is that something like this, like making a scarf out of D3, which is a JavaScript framework that makes a chart. I basically draw a SVG line and then like plot it into a knitted scarf. Actually, I forgot to put that demo. So I have some demo here. The other thing I did last year was making domain-specific language for a knitting machine. So this is a very, very small grammar set that I load a parser for, which you can code basically to make a textile. So let's like change it to 8 and change that. So what it's doing is that it's kind of like a REPL. So every time you type, my parser parses through the code, put it into AST, and then like returns the array of the matrix for the textile. Then my web app interprets that array and output as a canvas image. And what came out, so this was like inputting with code because I was interested in code and knitting, which I will get back to. And then another one that I did this Christmas was Sweaterify, which is like a fun application that I use the same thing in the back end. You can just upload your photo and then output it on how it looks like. So it's basically like a virtual sweater generator kind of thing. So, you know, I around the idea of software engineering, coding, and the thing that I do for fun, which is knitting. So this is like a physical version. So I uploaded. So I have a running joke on my meetup that I organized, which is a Broken.js, which we used to use a ViewSonic projector, and we always see the birds. And we started joking that the birds or ViewSonic is the official sponsor. So I created a sweater for them for our Christmas event. So like this picture is like literally like I grab underlying array from this software and then put it into the machine to knit. So it's hard to see here, but each pixel in this knitted fabric is actually the shape of a knitted object. So this is a square pixel, just like a pixelated picture. But if you zoom in, it is kind of like a knitted, what do you call it, stitches. So it lets me like experiment the idea, and then it's like even this sweater takes me 2 days to make, like a full weekend to make, but I can kind of experiment design faster if I have a virtually knit. So when Dan asked me to come speak, and I read this like description of this meetup, and I asked him actually like, you know, that's very honored, but like I don't do any of this like cool thing. I just like knit things. And he gave me like what kind of talk that should be and guidelines, and it was about like it should be educational and it should be like helping developers to be better at their craft. And while I can literally talk about how to better at craft, like making it public, what I do, like I usually go to JavaScript conference and talk about like how exactly I actually do it with code, which is like very subset of things, like like it's in JavaScript, so like subset, and then like a knitting, and then like doing image processing and like 200 pixel worth thing. It's like very niche. So I was like, what should I talk? And the thing I always conclude my talk was that like how I discovered this and how I learned this thing. So when I talked about like what's the craft for software developer, is that like, well, we all use like different languages, but like everything that we have in common is like we are really good at learning something new because industry is always changing, and being able to self-learn things that you need to do. So in my case, I wanted to do knit, which was not my job, but I wanted to knit with JavaScript, and I needed to figure out a whole bunch of computer science concepts that I wasn't equipped with coming from just a web developer, which basically went to a communication degree and then learned HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript. So like I did not do any of the computer science stuff. And I needed to figure out how those things work. But I learned it from knitting. So I learned a lot about computer by knitting. And I kind of want to show what my experience was like and hopefully kind of inspire you to explore things outside of just the command line and typing the thing. So one thing when I started coding, actually 4 or 5 years ago, actually 4.5 years ago. So I moved to New York, and at that time I was waiting for my green card. I'm originally from Japan, so like I couldn't legally work, and I used to be PM for other tech startups. So like familiar with being around with developers and like, you know, specking out application. But I was like, I'm kind of bored. And it was exactly like this week, like huge storm hit. And then like you were not going out if you don't have job, like you were not going outside anywhere. And I was like, well, you know what? Like I used to like talk to those people, how the output should be, but I never learned how to make those. So like, why don't I learn JavaScript? Well, it didn't have to be JavaScript, but it was available at the time. Like Code School was happening, and a lot of online learning was happening, and it was focused on JavaScript. So there, I quickly learned that this thing that I'm doing, which is coding, is a lot like knitting. So knitting is very binary, if you know. Knitting, the atomic unit for knitting is 2 stitches, the 2 form of ways to do it, which is knit stitch, which you pull the yarn from the back, and then purl stitch, which you push the yarn from the front. And it creates a 2 distinct face of the fabric. And the combination of those 2 are the pattern on your sweater. So like those like cuffs are 1 by 1, which is a repeat of like knit stitch, purl stitch, knit stitch, purl stitch. And then more intricate pattern like this diagonal one, and then like, you know, changing the, like drawing a picture with pattern is also, if you just closely look at it, just a combination of knit and purl stitch. And on top of that, the instruction to make how to knit those things comes in knitting pattern, which to me looks a lot like code. So there is like a repeated letter that's kind of like a variables, and there's more distinct language that's like a loop. So like until 2 stitches remaining, do this, or repeat from there, or repeat these whole sets. So I kind of like in my mind drew that line between, and I like wrote a JavaScript to knit it. So I translated this code, knitting code, the pattern, into in JavaScript. And it only took me like 20 minutes because it was already in code format. I only needed to change the syntax so that it is a JavaScript. It wasn't hard for me to just like convert those 2 things together. So from that exercise, this is what that knitting looked like in physical form, not the JavaScript form. I discovered that like, oh, knitting is like that ball of yarn is a free memory. And then that's there, knitted there is allocated memory and like manifestation of something data. And then it's knitting is a process that you lead the knitting instruction, interpret it or parse it, and then your hand executes your code. And that's what happens with like these physical object. So it was interesting. I did not stop there. So I have a tendency that if I like something, I just go deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's where I discovered this machine called knitting machine. And when I say knitting machine, everybody thinks that it's automatically like magically like print out this knitted fabric like a 3D printer. In fact, it's not. Like it's assisted environment that it's much easier for me to create a pattern and knit something way faster than you do it manually, but you still have to operate it like this. The machine, the one I have is from 80s, and it's designed, it has its own motherboard, the brain inside, and it's designed to talk to these kind of Game Boy looking thing that's supposed to plug it into TV, and then you just move the it's not joysticks, it just move the buttons to draw the picture, and then save it into floppy disk, and put it into knitting machine. So the process that I need to figure out in order to modernize this process so like I actually own this machine. It was like $64 from eBay. I don't have TV, so like I can't really test this, but I have this. Like just I don't know.
We believe you.
So the process that I basically wanted to make a smart knitting, so that I replaced it with computer. The whole process is that you need some kind of image input. You interpret it into a binary file, and then you put it into floppy disk drive, which in 80s it was a thing, but not anymore. So I learned my emulator on my machine and kind of like cheat on the machine. The machine thinks that I'm still talking to floppy disk, but in fact, it's talking to my computer over USB, and my computer is kind of like talking the protocol of floppy disk. It was done by many people before in Python and Ruby, and I wanted to do it in JavaScript because that's my primary language. And it was kind of like fun weekend project of like, if Python can do this, if Ruby can do this, JavaScript should be able to do this. So what I did was sit down with some other person's code and like learn what they were doing and drawing a picture of like what exactly the process is going. So if I enlarge it, it's basically taking a picture, turning it into black and white ones and zeros. That turns into an array of ones and zeros, and a whole bunch of bit shifting happens, and then turn it into hex and put it into knitting machine, and it happens. If you remember what dot matrix printer is, it's exactly like that. It works like this. So in process of doing this, I learned that this binary file that feels like magical to me, it's just a replacement for simple punched card. My machine is 80s, so it's Electronet. The name of the machine is Electronet, and it's computerized, and it was like new and cutting edge technology back then. But the machine before that was using very, very simple system like using punch card. So the binary file that I'm making is literally just have ones and zeros. That would be punched hole or no hole, and then just translate it in digital format. And that's got me kind of interested in like, where is this thing coming from? And this idea of using punch card to automate a machine and make a textile come from a machine called Jacquard loom, which is a piece of machine invented in 1700 that use these are the stack of punch card that's going into the machine, and I'll show you how this is being interpreted. So every time the hole or no hole is punched, the the pole is moved or not, and then that determines whether the yarn are picked up or not. So in a way, if the yarn is picked up, that's 1, and then it shows the color. But if not picked up, then it's 0, and it does not show the color. And that's how they program, in a way, the patterns that they were making. So this was interesting. it was very fascinating to me. But then I discovered that's actually based on computer. So Homer Hollis in 1889 was commissioned by US government to make electric tabulating system. And the problem that they had was 1880 census took 9 years to compile because it was before punch card, it was before computer, but then it was era of immigrants. So they had a bunch of data and then manually processing those took 9 years. And they quickly noticed that there is a problem, that then another census is approaching in 1890, and if this one took 9 years and we already have more immigrants, it's going to be hell. So they kind of had this like call to ideas, and Hollis came up with a machine that is tabulating machine that uses punch card to quickly sort out and then store the data. Now, the tabulating machine, he actually ended up funding the company called I forgot the name anyway, the tabulating machine company, and through acquisition, it became IBM. And that's where IBM's punch card related computer come from. Another fun fact is that the Hollis he looked at the loom and he thought this mechanism of using the punch card and no hole will make sense to make this machine. The loom that he looked at had a 80 hole width card. And that's where his tabulating machine card became 80 hole. That was carried when IBM made a computer that each card was 80 letters. And now we have a code spec of like each code has to be padded in the 80s. Like a lot of, you have editor that has a line at 80. That 80 number come from literally just happens to be that the loom was 80 hole. Like after this, I was like, okay, so I came from kind of like knitting and then discovered origin of computer. So like I feel like I can make computer now. So I did. And this GIF is not, oh yeah. So I made this like mock-up of 8-bit punch card computer, which was just like made by like scrap wood and a pins. And what it does is that every time the card is pressed against each pin, which there's 8 of them, so it's 8 digits, and it's basically one card is a 1 byte of data. It's basically acts like a button. So like button 2 is making contact, button 3 is making contact, and then I read that data. So I could have, it was very simple enough, I could have made it without Arduino, but it was easier for me to do it over Arduino to talk to the computer faster because they already have a USB. So I put it in there. I loaded JavaScript code to see, change it into a knitting pattern in the previous GIF that I was using after this. You can see that I was kind of outputting in the pattern. But also I wrote an interpreter to interpret a 8-digit number as ASCII letter. So you can now program technically in the stack of card like old days. Another problem that I faced was that now I understand how computer or how machine works and how this expects to talk to. But the image itself needs to be figured out, because it expects 1-bit image, which is like black and white, only black or white, so like no grayscaling at all. And I use Photoshop. I used to use Photoshop, but I have a tendency of like, how do I actually do this by like hand? And to me, coming from web developer, it was like image is just image tag. Like if you include it, it's just there. It's magically living in my computer and it shows up. But how do I draw it with code? Because I need to know what exactly going on. So that got me into like researching actually about how canvas lead the image and then like drawing things and what this weird thing called context, what the pixel is and what the subpixel is, and like I learned a whole bunch of things which I've never thought that I would do, and learn things like what is unit 8 clumped array? It's not array, but it's called array. It is a weird, but it's been 10 months of like, I want to do this thing. And in order to get there, somehow I learned a lot of computer and a lot of things that I would not, I actually don't need this as a web developer daily. Like if I'm using framework to make a website, I don't really need it. But like, I understood so much of what was behind that. And the one moment, I need to annotate this picture, it was great. I did this for 10 months. I went to a conference, Node.js conference, and here's Jamaya, who is a co-contributor to Node. And I could have a good conversation with him about how bad their documentation about buffer is, which buffer is a Node.js object to talk to low memory in the heap, which, by the way, in 10 months ago, I couldn't understand what I'm even saying. But I had a conversation with him saying like, hey, listen, I knit, and I learned about thing called bit, and this documentation is not good. Like, I don't think that's me, it's just like, this thing is bad. And then we kind of had a good session, and they actually improved the documentation afterwards. So it was great. So I kind of like wanted to share like, this is how I came into learning about computer science. And like, if I have like two things to say about it, is that like, being curious was very helpful to me. And nobody really stopped me like when I said that like, oh, knitting is like JavaScript, and everybody was, yay, that's great. And I kind of like went into there. And then also, don't be afraid to look under the hood. I hate when a junior developer comes into the team and senior developer teaching them, and they tell like, oh, just like, you know, when they have a question, they're just like, oh, that's just like what it is. Like, you just like remember, like, this is how to do it in Rails or Express. And like, I hate that, but like, if somebody wants to know something is how it's actually done, it may take longer to push the first project, but it's in long run, it's gonna help that person understand the whole landscape way better. And again, like if you have those person having questions and things, support and respect is awesome. Like I work for even though it is a small startup and we have a lot of things to do, my bosses are very supportive of what I do on the side project, and they are very respectful of like what I do. And you know, they don't really disregard that like, oh, you were doing toy thing. They think this as like part of important thing that I'm doing. So on that note, I need a help, whether I can expense my yarn as a software engineering operation. And thank you very much.